Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here. Welcome back. Today we're going over chapter 12, which is actually the last chapter in the course that we have to read. So hooray. And chapter 12 is Western Europe and Byzantium, years 1000 through 1500. So this is sort of a fascinating chapter. Now, it's a chunk. It's got so much going on, and it could have been broken up into Eastern Europe and Western Europe, I guess. But in any case, when you think about this, the beginning of the chapter, and when we look at the maps and when we read what's going on, I mean, remnants of Genghis Khan, are still going on in Central Asia and reaching all the way over into what's like Kyiv today in Ukraine. So there's a lot going on in the East, and you still have remnants of the Roman Empire. I mean, truly do, because you still have, the Eastern Roman Empire in Byzantium, and you also have the Holy Roman Empire, which is about kind of where Germany is today, with all of these different little feudal states within. And you have modern France forming, and you still have Muslims and Christians in Iberia and Spain. So there's a lot going on there alone, not to mention that, the plague happens in the 1300s, the 100 Years' War, an ongoing war between England and France for this whole period of time, which are the two, most powerful states, I guess you would say, in Europe at that time. And so there's a lot. I've always kind of said, the worst time and place and sex to be born would be to be born a male in France, in the French countryside in, say, 1310, 1315, because there was this massive famine after 4 or 5 years of too much rain and cool temperatures, and then the plague hit, and then the 100 Years' War hit, where, 2 or 3 million peasants were killed. So, next time we run out of toilet paper at the store because of the pandemic, we really don't have it that bad. So, that having been said, what I want to talk about first is sort of the intro. So the intro of this chapter, so you have the Crusades going on, and we're not going to spend too much time on the Crusades because this is a survey course, but the Crusades are like a holy war, and it's basically Christians versus Muslims the whole time, and it's sort of it is definitely international, but it's sort of on the notion. Think of the notion of like the UN. It's a pact of nations together, working together, or empires together. So that's fascinating, and you'll read about the first, second, third, fourth, fifth crusades in the book, and then they kind of die out. But it opens with the Crusades and talks about feudalism in Western Europe, and I'll talk a little bit more about feudalism in a second, the growth of towns and trade, so same old, and really at the early part of this chapter, really the more widespread use of iron tools, which before you have any kind of revolution as far as any kind of renaissance, or I would argue any kind of war or economic growth, you have to have an agricultural revolution, because you always have to feed people. And maybe it's because I grew up on a farm, but the growth in agriculture kind of spurs everything. And a lot of that, in the case of Europe, is a moderating climate, and also the introduction of iron plows. So that's a big deal. And then also they really started to figure out and work with the crop rotation system. And if you're a farmer, even from Ohio, that you plant beans one year, and then you go to hay one year, and you might do corn a few years, and whatever it needs to put nitrogen back in the soil, so on and so forth. So that sort of stuff they were doing in Western Europe, and so that increase in the yield per acre of agriculture means that you can support more people. People are healthier, which generally means you get more soldiers in the big picture. But anyway, so there's that. What's left of the Roman Empire? This is basically Germany, not quite. It's a lot more actually, but the Roman Empire, one way to think about this is that it's not really related to the old Western Roman Empire, other than its name, in maybe a political sense, but it is related in a religious Christian Catholic sense. So what I mean by that is that the church, and when I say the church in this time period, I'm talking about the Catholic Church and I'm talking about the Pope. Okay, at this time, the Pope was the Christian Catholic leader of the remnants of the Roman Empire. So if the Pope said that a king was head of the Holy Roman Empire, then that's what the king said he was. And so there's no direct connection to, like, Julius Caesar, if you will, but there is sort of this Catholic Church, Christian Roman Catholic connection, if that makes any sense. So the Roman Empire is still in place in Germany, and while you're looking at this map, notice that there's a lot of small little fiefdoms, okay? And when we talk about feudalism, we talk about these little feudal orders, these little states that are controlled by basically a rich guy, okay? A duke. On his property, these huge estates would be a castle, and all of these peasants, and all the property would be open to grazing for the peasants to raise animals, and the peasants would have to give whatever they farmed to the to the kingdom, to the castle. But it was a system of nobility. The modern version would be something like Downton Abbey, if you've watched anything like that on TV, but not really at all, because we're talking about the 1200s. But you kind of get the picture. There's dukes, and there's basically rich guys with castles that control their own little states, and oftentimes they have their own little armies. So that really explains these small little states in the map. And I've always told students, when you see a map like this with a lot of little states, and then 500 years later it's like one big state, you know for a fact that there were many wars and lots of death. So it talks about the Roman Empire, trying not to take too long, and this expansion of Christianity. So the Holy Wars, the Crusades, are sort of the ultimate in proselytizing, and the ultimate in sort of like aggressive missionary work, if you will. Where you're off to kill the enemy, which in this case are the Muslims, and a lot of this is over. Is the same stuff we're fighting over today. A lot of this is over the Middle East and who claims Jerusalem, and that sort of goes back and forth between Muslims and Christians, and it's still going on today. So nothing really changed, and that started in the year 1000. So whatever it is now, 2022. So yeah, not much has changed there. And then we start to see the 12th century Renaissance, which is really more. I would argue is really more Spanish related than anything else, but the point being that the Christians, especially in Spain, taking advantage of some of the Muslim libraries, started to get a lot more interested in literature and art and philosophy and Greek language and that sort of thing. So, the point being that there's more people, and people are better fed, and people, usually white guys, or guys anyway, people have access to the libraries, and so there's more thinking going on, okay? And a lot of that is happening through the church. So when we think about schools like Oxford University in England, it started way back then. These were colleges that were part of the scholastic movement of the church that ended up being private universities. But that all starts to happen early on. So that's pretty cool. Around the 14th century. So 1200s, 1300s. So the Third Crusade, the Fourth Crusade. No need to go on. We could go into a lot of depth, but again, since it's a survey class, know they happened, know they were basically holy wars between the Christians and the Muslims, and a lot of that stuff happened in Jerusalem, and you're good enough to go in this course. So, and there's so much more reading to do on Crusades if you guys want to get into that. But again, unfortunately, this is an overview. So we move on. Eastern Europe, we talked about, and I talked about the remnants of Genghis Khan. We read about Southeast Asia a chapter or two ago, and these khanates, these states that were run by khans, usually related to Genghis Khan, this is still going on. So, my homeland, Hungary, Ukraine, which obviously we're all paying attention to right now, the city of Kyiv, which is under siege right now by the Russians, was under siege then by the Mongols, millions of people killed. So that city's not new to death and destruction. And so there's stuff going on in Eastern Europe, and it's by no means settled. And also, this 100 Years' War I talked about, between France and England. France and England are the two preeminent, hefty powers in Europe at this point in time. Germany is not really formed yet in any way, shape, or form. Well, sort of, but not as Germany. So France and England are going at it all the time. There's a little blurb about the Magna Carta in there. So the Magna Carta was an agreement, a document signed in 1215 in Runnymede, which is in London on the banks of the Thames. And basically, it was a document that said, hey, the king has limited power. Okay, you can't come in, and the king can't come in and take my daughter. The king can't come in and just take whatever. There's limited power to the king, and it said that. But what it also said, the main focus of it was that the king can't raise the taxes of the people without talking to the consul or the parliament. Okay, so the Magna Carta is a big deal because it established this idea that no one is above the law, even kings. So that happens in 1215 in England, and I bring that up because we're starting to see this more sophisticated social policy, if you will. All right, and adherence to laws, and maybe a hint towards a little bit of liberalism in the sense that absolutism is starting to be questioned. So there's that, and more on the Crusades. Probably the next couple of things important to this chapter for takeaways in this time period. Scholasticism, again, you might have heard of St. Thomas Aquinas. Again, Christian Catholic, who's really into education, and again starts to manifest a relationship between education and knowledge and religion at the same time. So a super important person in Christianity, and I would argue a really important person in education in general also, because of this idea that you could bring science and religion together in different ways. So St. Thomas Aquinas begins to validate science instead of scientists becoming heretics. Maybe now they're more accepted in society in the big picture. So there's that. And then the 14th century crisis, when I opened this lecture, I talked about a really bad time being born would be in the early 1300s in France, and that's because of all the things I talked about. You talk about climate change, so around 1316, 1315, the climate got really wet and cooler and threw off the growing seasons for like 3 seasons. So, and there was like a livestock disease going around at the same time. So as far as the food supply, went, it was devastating. So remember, this is before, refrigeration, warehouses, grocery stores, no Kroger, no Costco, no Sam's Club, no nothing. So, when the crops failed and livestock got sick, it was a huge problem. There's, millions of people starved to death in Europe. So again, just because of climate change, and, that can always happen. So again, no scare tactics, but it's happened before. And then between 1346 and 1350 or somewhere in there, you had the bubonic plague. So, the ultimate mega pandemic with no medicine and no knowledge on what's causing the problem. So if you could imagine COVID, but with no knowledge of what's happening, not being able to figure out where it's coming from or what it even is, there's no germ theory, the plague is a really bad deal. And the worst thing about it is in continental Europe, like in France, it wipes out half the population. Okay, half the population at the same time. The 100 Years' War is going on in France, so not a great time. So that's what the 14th century crisis is, and then up to the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, which is 14th, 15th century Europe, and that's the time of Leonardo da Vinci and all of those great artists and all of the great science that came out of the European Renaissance, and that word means rebirth in French, in case you didn't know that. And there's a great interest in humanism, in poetry and literature, and also art and architecture, and also a sort of a reanalysis of the Bible because in Greek and in Latin, like in original manuscripts, because of the bastardization of the Bible over the years by the church. So scholars had more of an interest in the Bible, and it was revealing. And we don't get any farther than that in this chapter. We don't get to the Reformation in this chapter, but these are all components of the church being forced to become more transparent, I guess, is sort of the best way to set it up at this point. So to conclude, there was a lot that happened in this chapter. But again, France, Germany, and Spain are starting to form as they are today. There's the Crusades, which were holy wars. There's the 100 Years' War between England and France. And, this thing ends with Columbus sailing to the New World, right? 1400. So that's sort of the big deal. Europe's starting to come together, and now that Columbus is going to go to Europe and start bringing back gold, and Holland and England and France are all going to compete with Columbus and Spain, and Portugal's going to get into it. All of these empires start to change, and they all start to become more nationalized because of mercantilism. So we're not there, and we're not going there. But that's it for the book. That's it for the chapter. Thanks for hanging on and bearing with me. We'll have a quick lecture in the middle of next week and go over the final exam. Until then, have a great day. Bye-bye.